10 years ago, he left a crumbling farmhouse and a broken past to fight wars in unforgiving deserts. Now, a medically discharged Navy SEAL returns home, only to find the ruins replaced by a thriving homestead and a stranger holding a shotgun to his chest, claiming it's hers. The worn tires of John Mallister's 2004 Ford F-150 crunched against the familiar yet strangely alien gravel of County Road 9. The Montana sky was a sprawling canvas of bruised purple and deep twilight orange, casting long, haunting shadows across the Beartooth Mountains. John rolled down the window, letting the biting evening air flood the cab. It smelled of damp pine, woods, and impending rain. It smelled like a ghost. Sitting shotgun, his retired K-9 partner, a massive German shepherd named Ranger, let out a low, rumbling whine. Ranger shifted his 75 pounds of muscle, resting a heavy scarred snout on John's thigh. The dog's left ear was clipped from a piece of shrapnel in Fallujah, and he bore a titanium canine tooth that caught the fading dashboard light. "I know, buddy," John murmured, his voice a growly rasp and used to casual conversation. He scratched the dog behind his good ear. "We're almost there." John hadn't seen Oak Haven in exactly a decade. 10 years since he walked away from the 60-acre plot of dying crops, the collapsing barn, and the suffocating weight of his parents' mounting debts. When his father, a man broken by bad harvests and worse luck, suffered a fatal heart attack, 20-year-old John did the only thing he felt he could do. He ran. He signed his name on a dotted line, handed the keys to a local attorney to manage the mess, and vanished into the grueling pipeline of the United States Navy SEALs. For a decade, his home was the belly of C-130 transport planes, the sweltering heat of the Middle East, and the freezing waters of Coronado. He traded his father's plow for an $416 Hong Kong assault rifle. But 3 months ago, an improvised explosive device outside a compound in Syria had violently rewritten his future. The blast had thrown him through a brick wall, shattering his femur, rupturing his eardrums, and leaving him with a medical discharge and a chest full of medals he kept in a rusted coffee can. Ranger had dragged him out of the rubble by his plate carrier. They were a package deal now. 2 broken soldiers sent out to pasture. John's plan was simple, born of exhaustion and a desperate need for silence. He would return to the derelict Mallister farm. He expected the roof to be caved in. He expected the fields to be swallowed by knapweed and thistle. He had a military pension, a small payout, and enough carpentry skills to patch the leaks and live out his days in absolute undisturbed isolation. He downshifted as he approached the final bend, his muscles tensing, his right thigh throbbed, a dull, rhythmic ache that predicted the incoming storm better than any meteorologist. He rounded the corner, his eyes drifting toward where the rusted, leaning mailbox used to be. John slammed on the brakes. The truck skidded to a violent halt, sending up a cloud of pale dust. Raymond Slam barked a sharp tactical alert sound and sat bolt upright, his dark eyes scanning the perimeter. "What the hell?" John whispered. He put the truck in park, leaving the engine idling, and stepped out into the twilight. He didn't feel the pain in his leg. He didn't feel the cold. He only felt a profound, disorienting shock. The rusted mailbox was gone. In its place stood a sturdy hand-carved cedar post with a copper box painted on the side in neat elegant lettering where the words Whispering Pines Estang. But that was nothing compared to the property itself. The overgrown dying fields John remembered were gone. In their place were perfectly manicured pastures fenced in by fresh white timber. A herd of black Angus cattle grazed peacefully in the distance. The collapsing termite-hollowed barn had been entirely rebuilt, painted a deep, striking barn red with a new tin roof that gleamed under the first emerging stars. And then there was the farmhouse. John swallowed hard, his throat tight. The wraparound porch that had been rotting away was pristine, adorned with hanging ferns and a heavy oak swing. Warm yellow light spilled from the windows, illuminating the freshly painted white siding and forest green shutters. Smoke drifted lazily from the rebuilt stone chimney. It looked like a photograph from a country living magazine. It looked nothing like the graveyard of failures he had left behind. Did the attorney sell it? John's mind raced. No, he couldn't have. The deed is in a trust in my name. The military was paying the property taxes from my allotment, weren't they? Anger, swift and hot, began to replace the confusion. This was his land. It was the only thing he had left of his bloodline. He whistled sharply. Ranger leapt from the cab, landing silently on the gravel, immediately falling into a protective heel at Jay's left side. "Come on," John said, his voice dropping into the icy command register he used on deployments. He unlatched the heavy iron gate and walked up the long gravel driveway. His combat boots crunched loudly, purposefully as he approached the porch. The front door swung open. The light from the hallway framed a silhouette. It was a woman, perhaps in her early 30s, wearing a faded denim jacket and boots. But it wasn't her attire that stopped John in his tracks. It was the undeniable metallic clack-clack of a pump-action shotgun chambering a shell. "That's far enough, mister," a steady, feminine voice called out. The barrel of a Remington 870 was leveled squarely at Jay's chest. Ranger let out a vicious snarl, his hackles rising into a rigid mohawk along his spine. He stepped in front of John, baring his titanium tooth, ready to launch himself at the threat. "Ranger, stay," John commanded softly in German. The dog instantly froze, though a low growl continued to vibrate in his chest. John slowly raised his hands, keeping them open and visible at shoulder height. The trained operator in him analyzed the situation in microseconds. The woman's grip was tight, but her stance was slightly too wide. She was frightened but determined. "Ma'am," John said, keeping his voice even and calm. "Lower the weapon. My dog is highly trained, and if you twitch that barrel, he will tear your arm off before you can pull the trigger. I don't want anyone getting hurt." "You're trespassing on private property," the woman fired back, her voice wavering only slightly. "I've already called the county sheriff. They'll be here in 10 minutes. "That makes 2 of us who'd like to speak to the sheriff," John replied, taking a slow, deliberate half-step forward into the light of the porch. "Because you're standing in my house." The woman's brow furrowed, but the barrel of the shotgun didn't dip an inch. "I don't know what kind of scam you're trying to pull, but I own this property. Now, back off." John let out a bitter, exhausted sigh. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind the bone-deep weariness he had carried from Syria. "My name is John Mallister," he said, speaking slowly. "My father was Thomas Mallister. This land has been in my family for 3 generations. I left 10 years ago, and I hold the deed." The name hit her. John watched her eyes widen in the porch light. The shotgun wavered, dipping toward the wooden floorboards. "Mallister," she breathed out. "But the county said the previous owner was deceased. They said the estate abandoned it." John's jaw clenched. "I assure you, I am very much alive." The front screen door pushed open wider, and an older man stepped out onto the porch. He moved with a slight limp, leaning heavily on a carved walking stick. He had thick silver hair and a weathered face that spoke of decades working outdoors. He wore a heavy flannel shirt and suspenders. "Put the gun down, Sarah," the older man said quietly. "He's telling the truth." Sarah looked back at the older man, conflicted, before finally engaging the safety and lowering the weapon. She leaned it against the doorframe, though she kept herself positioned between John and the older man. "I'm Arthur," the older man said, stepping forward to the edge of the porch steps. He looked down at John, his pale blue eyes studying the scarred face, the rigid posture, and the tactical service dog standing guard, Arthur Pendleton. "And this is my daughter, Sarah Jenkins. We didn't break into your home, son. We bought it." "That's impossible," John stated flatly. "I set up an allotment with military finance. The property taxes were supposed to be deducted and sent to the county automatically." Arthur sighed heavily, rubbing the back of his neck. "Come inside, Mr. Mallister, it's too cold to litigate this on the porch. Your dog is welcome, too." John hesitated. Every instinct screamed at him to clear the house, to treat this as a hostile occupation. But these weren't insurgents. It was a single mother and her aging father. "Ranger Fuss," he commanded. The dog moved to his side, and the two walked up the steps. Stepping into the farmhouse was like walking into an alternate dimension. The layout was exactly as John remembered. The central staircase, the living room to the left, the kitchen in the back, but the peeling wallpaper was gone, replaced by warm rustic paint. The sagging floorboards had been ripped out and replaced with polished hickory. The smell of rot had been banished by the scent of cinnamon, roasting chicken, and pine saw. What stopped John cold, however, was the living room. Sitting near the fireplace was his mother's antique cherrywood rocking chair. It had been broken, missing a runner, gathering dust in a corner when he left. Now it was flawlessly restored, a hand-knit blanket draped over its back. Sarah saw him staring at it. "I found it in the barn," she said softly, her defensive posture softening into an awkward guilt. "It was too beautiful to throw away. My dad fixed the runner." "Who gave you the right to touch my things?" John snapped. The pain of seeing his mother's chair causing a flare of defensive anger. "The state of Montana," Sarah replied, her own spine stiffening. She walked over to a heavy oak desk in the corner, opened a drawer, and pulled out a thick manila folder. She tossed it onto the coffee table. 3 years ago, a county tax deed sale. The property was seized due to 7 years of unpaid taxes. It went to a public auction. Dad and I used my late husband's life insurance money to buy it. We poured every dime we had into restoring this place. Legally, Mr. Mallister, this is our home." John walked over to the table and flipped the folder open. He scanned the official county seals, the signatures, the dates. His chest tightened. It was a legitimate tax deed. "My allotment," John muttered, pulling his phone from his pocket, though he had no signal out here. "When I deployed to Afghanistan, there was a banking error with DEFA's, the military finance office. My accounts were frozen for 3 months because of a suspected identity theft. I thought the lawyer I hired." John trailed off. "The lawyer, Gary Higgins, the man was supposed to manage the estate." "Higgins was disbarred 5 years ago," Arthur said, reading John's mind. "Embezzlement. He was taking clients' money and throwing it away on riverboat casinos in Nevada. Your tax money never made it to the county, son. And because you were overseas and unreachable, the county foreclosed," John finished, feeling a cold dread pool in his stomach. "Wait," Sarah interjected, looking between John and her father. "You said you were military deployed." "Navy SEAL," John said. 10 years, just medically discharged." Sarah's face went completely pale. She put a hand to her mouth, sinking onto the arm of the sofa. "Oh my God, Dad, the SC." "The what?" Arthur asked, frowning. "The Service Member Civil Relief Act," John said. The legal briefing from his out processing suddenly flashing in his mind. It's a federal law. It protects active duty military personnel from default judgments, foreclosures, and tax sales while they are deployed. John looked up, meeting Sarah's horrified gaze. The county wasn't legally allowed to sell my farm. Mrs. Jenkins. Not while I was in a combat zone. The tax sale is invalid. Silence descended on the room, heavy and suffocating. The only sound was the crackle of the wood in the fireplace, and Rare's steady breathing. Sarah looked around at the gleaming hardwood floors, the newly installed windows, the kitchen she had remodeled with her own bleeding hands. She had spent 3 years of her life and her husband's blood money, turning a nightmare into a dream for her and her father. And now, in a matter of 5 minutes, a ghost had walked through the front door with a federal law that could wipe it all away. Tears welled in Sarah's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She crossed her arms tightly. So, what now? You just kick us out into the cold? We have nowhere else to go. We put $150,000 into this property. John looked at the woman. He looked at Arthur, who was staring intently at him with an unreadable expression. He didn't want to ruin this family, but he had bled for his country, lost his brothers in arms, lost his hearing, and lost his leg mobility. This farm was his sanctuary. Before John could answer, Arthur tapped his walking stick against the floorboard. There's something else we need to discuss, John, the old man said, his voice strangely calm. Because while the county might have made a mistake with the paperwork, my bidding on this specific farm wasn't a coincidence. John narrowed his eyes, his tactical instincts flaring again. What do you mean? Arthur limped slowly toward the fireplace, looking up at a framed painting of the Montana landscape that hung above the mantel. Your father, Thomas, didn't just die of a broken heart over bad crops, Arthur said, turning back to face John. And you weren't the only one he owed a massive debt to before he passed. He owed me, John. He owed me something a lot more valuable than money. And I came to this farm to collect. The fire popped. A sharp crack that sounded too much like a distant sniper rifle. John's hand instinctively twitched toward his hip, but he forced his muscles to relax. He stared at Arthur Pendleton, the older man's face bathed in the dancing orange light of the hearth. My father owed you? John asked, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. Thomas Mallister was a lot of things. He was a terrible farmer, a stubborn old mule, and a man who drank too much cheap whiskey when the frost killed his winter wheat. But he paid his debts. If he owed you money, I'll pay it right now out of my military back pay. Arthur shook his head slowly, leaning heavily on his carved walking stick. Not money, John. Your father didn't owe me a dime. Arthur glanced at his daughter. Sarah had her arms wrapped around herself, her gaze fixed firmly on the hickory floorboards. The defensive fire had left her, replaced by a haunting, hollow sorrow. He owed us a life, Arthur said softly. The silence that followed was suffocating. Ranger let out a soft whine, pressing his heavy side against John's good leg. The dog could smell the cortisol, the sudden spike of adrenaline and stress radiating from his handler. Speak plainly, Mr. Pendleton, John said, his tactical composure beginning to fracture. Arthur walked over to the leather armchair and lowered himself into it with a stifled groan. It was October 2013, he began, staring into the flames. Just a few months before you enlisted and left Oak Haven. We were running a small family-owned outfit back then, Pendleton and Sons Excavation. My son-in-law, Michael, was my lead foreman. He was married to Sarah. John shifted his gaze to Sarah. She was twisting a silver band on her right hand. We had an unseasonably warm autumn followed by a freak torrential freeze, Arthur continued. The soil turned to concrete and the county irrigation canals backed up. Your father's lower 60 acres were flooding. If he didn't dig a trench and divert the water, he was going to lose his entire livelihood in a matter of days. I remember that freeze, John murmured. I was in Billings trying to secure a loan for him at First Interstate Bank. They denied it. Exactly, Arthur said. Thomas was desperate, panicked. He called me begging for help, but my crew was contracted out in Bozeman. I told him I couldn't spare the heavy machinery until the weekend. But Thomas couldn't wait. He drove over to my equipment yard in the middle of the night and took an old 1998 Caterpillar excavator. He didn't ask, he just took it. John's stomach plummeted.